Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Happy lunchtime, and thanks ever so much for joining us today. This is our first event of National Adoption Week 2024. So we're probably more nervous today than we will be by Friday, but bear with us. Now, one request is I can see that some of you have your cameras on, which is fine, but you don't need to. You're really welcome to turn those off. It's up to you. We will be having a chat running through today, so you can pop things into the chat. My colleague Emma is going to be looking after that chat. And if we have time towards the end, then we're going to be attending to any questions or themes which have come up in the chat. But our theme today is adoption and adolescence. And we've got some fantastic young adults, I would say, to come and speak about this. Now, our thinking behind this was very much that teenager time and adolescence is very much the time where adoptive families hit the rocks and things become extremely difficult some of the time. We know that adoption breakdown happens more during that time. Now, adolescence and teenage life is a really difficult period for everybody, but for adopted people, it raises particular challenges. And what we wanted to do was bring a group of people together who have experienced this reasonably recently. Now, I also was adopted and I had a really difficult teenage life, but to be honest with you, it was so long ago now that a lot of it I've managed to blank out of my mind and don't think about very much. Whereas these guys who range between their early 20s and early 30s are recent visitors to that period and also are probably in some senses still dealing with a lot of the issues that have been raised by that period, as in a funny kind of way. So am I, really. So that was the idea, to ask them to reflect on that period and see what light they could show on it so that we can help our adopted young people better than we do at the moment. So I think we're going to do some introductions and then we're going to start with the chat. So I'm Mike Hancock and I'm the National Strategic Lead at PAC-UK, and I'm going to start with Dawn, who's my first on my screen. Thanks, Dawn.
You're welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm Dawn. I am an adopted adult. I'm also training to be a social worker. So this is a topic I'm particularly passionate about. Thanks, everyone.
Great stuff. Thanks, Dawn. And then I'm going to turn to Tiegan.
Hi, I'm Tiegan. I am 22 years old. I was adopted at the age of 4 years old after 2 years in care. I'm now a lived experience consultant and trainer and just finished a degree in sociology.
Great stuff. Thanks, Tiegan. And then we've got Aaliyah.
So my name is Aaliyah. I'm 24. I just graduated with a law degree and I'm currently back in postgraduate study, again in law. I work for a legal regulator and I was taken away from my birth family at 7 months. I was formally adopted at the age of 2 and I have a lot of experience in care at various points, and I am not typically well put together adult. I mean, it is like that now, but it didn't always start that way. It took a lot of progress and work. So yes, I want to make that perfectly clear.
Thanks, Aaliyah. That's great. JP, are you there somewhere?
There. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Perfect. I'm JP. I'm 26. I was at age 6 and I help out with PAC-UK doing events like this as a volunteer.
Thanks very much, JP. And then last but not least, Peter, are you there somewhere?
Hi, I'm Peter. So I'm the oldest of the bunch. I'm 33. So I was adopted in 1994 officially. So 30 years ago, this April, was the 30th anniversary of my adoption order. I'm a journalism graduate up in Stirling in Scotland, originally from England. Just finished my postgraduate degree in international journalism as well. And in the last 2 and a bit years, I've kind of ended up stumbling into care experience and journalism and adoption issues as my specialism. My current situation is I'm trying to make it as a freelancer while on universal credit, and I'm homeless, which echoes where I was about 12 years ago, right at the beginning of my 20s, trying to make that transition to adulthood with a bit of a stumble here and there.
Thank you, Peter. and they are a fantastically fine bunch of young adults. What strikes me, and what particularly just came out in what Peter said there, was that on the face of it, you look at these guys and you think, well, you're a very well-functioning, successful bunch of young people. Adoption must be doing the business. And I think I don't think they'll mind me saying this, that once you scrape away the surface, you'll discover that actually their experiences and the things that they've had to go through in their lives are really particular to this situation and extremely interesting, I hope. So I'm just going to start by asking them all, and they can chip in, just to give us a flavour of what that teenage life was like, what it was like. What was it like being an adopted teenager? What was your experience like? Would someone like to start us off?
I'm happy to jump the gun and go first.
Go ahead, Dawn.
So we're saying teenager. I think mine kicked off at about 11, kind of as I transitioned into secondary school. As we all know, that's a huge move from the really, I think, supportive, really like wraparound care of primary school into secondary school. Such a big leap, and what coincided with that was my behaviour going on a downward spiral. So my teenage years, I was rebellious. My behavior really just, I was violent towards my parents, towards my siblings. I dropped out of school. I self-harmed. I had issues with alcohol, issues with relationships, issues with appropriate relationships and appropriate behaviors. And all of this kind of going on whilst trying to do GCSEs, trying to do A-levels, trying to meet society's expectations of what a healthy and happy adoptee should be. So yeah, teenage years, I look back and I'm really not regretful because they've made me who I am, but wish there had been more support, or I'd been more aware of support that had been available. And I just think we don't talk a lot about what it's like to be a teenager as an adoptee, and how you go from feeling really comfortable and really happy to having all these changes, and how to manage them and how to support adoptees through them, because they're challenging for adoptees and adopters. But how can we get through them? I think this is the first time I've been on an event talking about it. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Dawn. And yes, in a general point, so much change has already happened in an adoptee's life that then that happening again or facing other change is really tricky a lot of the time. Who else would like to tell us a bit about what that was like? Peter.
So with me, it was a tiny bit of background quickly. I was born with developmental problems, so I wasn't walking or talking properly until about the age of 4 or 5. I then went through that thing which any social workers listening will be aware of, the term catching up. So by the age of about 8 years old, I was academically excelling, making friends. I didn't present as disabled. In my teen years, that all started to unravel about the age of 14/15, when I started zoning out a lot in lessons. I ran away 3 times, which got me sent to CAMS. And the person working with me had already worked with my 2 biological siblings, one of which I've been adopted with, and another one came along later, who both were severely special needs with ADHD, off the scale sort of thing. And he went, hang on, we know that they're quite severe ADHD. We've never checked how bad you are, Peter. So they had a look, and it turns out I was quite severe. And so by the age of about 15, which is very late, they said, we need to put you onto medication. And that it took me at least into my early 20s to start taking it seriously. And even to this day, I struggle with the whole managing my identity and my special needs and my fully functioning, what's going on there. On the adoption side of things, it wasn't as big a factor because I was adopted before I had any memories. And my adopted parents always had this great answer, which was, if you're old enough to ask the question, you're old enough to know the answer. And I was starting to ask more questions around that time and becoming a little bit more curious. And I do remember at the time starting to form plans in my head as the oldest of all of my adopted siblings and adopted half siblings from the same biological mother, and the only one who wasn't severe special needs, that I was going to be the one that would have to, in adult life, find our birth mother, access my records, and start answering questions, not just for myself, but for everyone else in the brood, or whatever you want to call it.
Right. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, that sounds challenging to say the least. Who else would like to share with us? Tiegan.
Yeah, I think for me, teenagerhood was very challenging, but I wouldn't say for the reasons people might expect. Like, I didn't really have that rebellion, I didn't start drinking or anything like that, but it still was a really challenging and confusing time for me. And I think the other reality as well was life didn't feel like it was going in a way it should do. And I didn't think that was my fault, but everyone's making it seem like my fault, especially school. School was incredibly challenging for me. Secondary school, I really was not understood in relation to the impact of being adopted, but also always been called quirky, different. And actually, that turns out I was neurodivergent, but at that time, no one wanted to diagnose me that, even consider that thought. You know, a lot of the time it was like, oh, it's just how your trauma is, oh, it's just your early life experience, which was always a bit ironic then in the same conversation being told, oh yeah, your trauma doesn't impact you at all, like your behavior isn't due to that. There was a lot of blame put on me, blame for doing badly in my GCSE marks, blame for being bullied. There's just a whole lot of blame, which was really challenging, you know, in your early teens to be dealing with of this just constant you are the problem through school, which you spend the majority of your time at. And then it sort of carried on into college. I failed my AS levels again because I wasn't understanding that respect of, you know, I'd finally been diagnosed dyslexic and autistic, but there was still a lot of, oh, you just need to try harder. Oh, I don't know why you're not doing as well as you should do. Um, and then I did go on to another course, but that just did not inspire me at all. And it did slightly get better in my third year. But I think all of this also had a massive impact in my home life because obviously we were constantly having to battle someone or the system, you know, which it takes a lot of work, if, especially for my adoptive parents who are already parenting, you know, to then having to be at the school gates almost every single day, but also seeing how it was impacting me. And also that whole emotion and I think the impact of what I was experiencing day to day life would just come out at home. I was quite violent, you know, doors were being banged, you know, I would just argue. And actually, that really impacted how our family relationship was. And I think we were at points near a breakdown just because it's like, how can we keep going forward, especially as nothing is changing? And I think that was really hard for us to understand why nothing was changing. And also, I think my parents couldn't quite understand how things at school were so bad because they knew I loved education. You know, they know I love learning. So it's like, how's this going on? And I think that's where we were really lucky. But eventually, actually, COVID happened because we were able to just take a breather. I was able to relax. I could step away from these environments that had caused me so many challenges and as a family challenges. And actually from there things improved. I was able to relax. I started being able to learn in a way that worked for us, and our family were just able to take a breather as a whole and start doing things we enjoyed together. And I think our relationship really rekindled in a positive way. So at later teens was a lot better, but early teens was just a nightmare that I almost have blanked from my brain most of the time.
Thank you for sharing that, Tiegan. I mean, and we're going to be picking up some of these points as we go along about how change happened, what interventions were good, about birth family and that kind of thing. But I just want to get a bit of a flavour from everybody before we drill down into that a little bit more. So Aaliyah or JP, would either of you like to say anything? Yeah, Aaliyah.
So I would say my teenage years were, for me, the absolute worst, the pits, but there were also, I would say, I had a really good time at secondary school. I loved my secondary school. I was deputy head girl. I had a bit of an issue with bullying at the very start, but I was friends with nearly every single group and lots of people. But I was struggling so much internally. And I think the big problem was that even though I knew I was adopted from the very beginning, from when I was incredibly, incredibly little, and my adopted parents were brilliant at telling me that, there was a big thing in my mind about being not perfect, but just functioning and to not think about it. And I really didn't. In fact, I used to tell people when I was fairly little and they wouldn't believe me because my birth family mix is the same as my adoptive family mix. And obviously, ethnically, we look similar enough. We're from the same cultural background. It's quite rare. So I was very lucky to be placed with them. I also have an adopted brother who has no blood ties to me, but he is my brother. And he also struggled in his teenage years, but for different reasons. I was a high achieving perfectionist and he was the opposite. He really struggled in school. And while I was getting fantastic GCSEs, I'm talking 7 A stars, 5 A's, 2 B's. I was breaking down inside. I had a huge issue with body dysmorphia because I didn't get biological mirroring, and also I didn't see anything positive within myself. I struggled massively with anorexia, and that was the first time that people realized something was wrong with me because I couldn't hide it anymore. I was very physically unwell, and up until that point nobody knew at all that I was care experienced or adopted. And I think that was the point when things started to unravel. Then CAMS got involved and helped me out, and then obviously the minute I turned 18 and went to university, it was kicked out and kind of being told to make your own way in the world with adult mental health services. And that is kind of an ongoing battle. So I didn't have any mental health support from the ages of 18 to 21. And from 21 to 24, things were almost plain sailing. I managed to get some therapy. And the minute I was kind of told psychotherapy would be best for me, I'm now being moved, because I'm 24, to adult mental health services, which is 25 and onwards. So they can't place me for another whole year, and then the whole cycle starts again, which is very kind of distressing. I found my birth family, or went digging, in my 3rd year of university, which was so impactful. It led me to repeat the year. And I feel like one of the big things for me is that throughout my teen years and my early adulthood, I am being compared directly against my peers who are not care experienced and who are not adopted. Most of my peers live with their parents, and they have that option. They are being financially supported by their parents. They have connections and support. And I feel like in the working world, there is no time for reprieve. And although it's all well and good being kind to oneself, there is no time not to be functional. And I feel like that's something I struggle with, especially in the kind of industry of law. You have to be competitive and on the top of your game. And if you're not, there's almost no time to think about actually taking a bit of a breather.
Yeah, thank you, Aaliyah. Good, well said. And we're going to come back to therapy, interventions, and birth family actually. But JP, what would you like to add?
I'd just say that I went from a nursery to a primary, and then from primary school to high school. But in high school, that's when I had a teaching assistant, I think, sort of assigned to me. She was a lady, really great. She was like a mentor to me. She took me under her wing. She took interesting things and interesting. She helped me feel acknowledged. So I'd often paint as I'd wait for my mum to pick me up from school, and I'd draw stuff. And then on a weekend, she'd take something that I'd drawn and she'd paint it herself, do a landscape to it and bring it to life, and then bring it into me. And just like sort of, she was sharing my sort of world with me, and I felt sort of seen for the first time with her. And then I got bullied in high school because I was adopted. My adopted mum had actually trained to be a teacher at my high school. And so one of the teachers then knew I was adopted and sort of outed me in class. And so I was bullied there, like, forever after, basically till I left high school because of that. And yeah, I think that really badly affected my mental health, but I had a great social worker who at around 18 came into my life. Yeah, if it wasn't for her, I probably wouldn't be here today, to be honest.
Thank you, JP. And you've neatly brought us on to the next sort of thing that I wanted to discuss, really, which was what did help, if interventions happened, or whether that was a formal intervention like therapy or the social worker, or whether that was just something less formal. What do you think during that? And let's stay with that teenage sort of time. What do you think helped you, Peter?
So I think the worker at CAMS, his name was Michael. He was fantastic in identifying ADHD. I think my parents, as I said, were fantastic in what they did. But weirdly enough, when I was interviewing my dad earlier this summer for my project, just on background for myself, he kind of illustrated a point, which was, I talked about the catching up. Now, I've got a good 10 years, I think, on a lot of the panel here. So it's now a little bit more known. But back in the 2000s, and I turned 18 in 2009. I finished school in 2010. There wasn't really any information for parents when I was turning 12, 13, 14, saying that, hey, if they've caught up and they're presenting normal, that doesn't mean that the problem's gone away. So my dad actually admits that he was almost a bit blinded by the fact that I had two extremely special needs siblings who, next to them, I looked like a candle next to a wildfire, but next to anyone else, I started to look like a wildfire next to a candle, and there was no preparation for it. And also, as I said, I found out when I was about 14, 15, the extent to which my ADHD was there and getting medicated. I didn't start taking my ADHD seriously, and it is a disability, until my early 20s, and I'm still balancing that identity. And so I think that the whole preparing parents more to saying, look, your child may catch up, the developmental problems from the early years, they may have caught up by 7 or 8, but this stuff can still present in their teen years. That's now well known, and that is crucial. Another thing, which this is different for different people. So I know some people don't want to interact with their care experience and their adoptions at that age. I, especially in recent years, found I love learning about things, and education and getting back into education was the best thing ever for me. I feel like if I'd had more information on the effects of care experience as I was going through that, it might have helped me make more sense of what was going on around me. So that option to have a bit more context and information to understand things around trauma and other bits and pieces would have been difficult to deal with, but treating it almost as a learning experience myself might have been a way for me to process what I was going through better. And
Yes.
maybe it would have helped my transition into adulthood more.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Good point. Dawn.
So I just want to pick up on Peter's point on learning and understanding the impacts of trauma and adoption on adoptees. Not for me, but I felt that none of my teachers were adequately positioned to support me. They just weren't aware the effects adoption have. If I was playing out in class because of something that had happened at home, for example, so when I was 16, mid GCSEs, my sister's adoption broke down and she went back into care, which was huge because I was re-traumatized, going through all that loss all over again, thought I would also go back into care. I passed my GCSEs, I got 5 Bs and 4 Cs, but I was seen as a failure because the grades weren't high enough for my school. And that was said to me by teachers, who, if they had any knowledge and any understanding of what an achievement it was to even sit those exams during that period, I think the outcome would have been very, very different. And for me, that's probably, I didn't have any support. I didn't have any interventions or therapy in my teenage years. And I think school is probably one of the first places I would start. I think there's such a disconnect between social care and social services and educational services in providing support across the board. There's a lack of cohesion, a lack of communication, and I think that's where some of the biggest problems arise. I know I got bullied in school, I know what I experienced in school. Those experiences weren't being shared with my family properly, they weren't being shared with a social worker, they weren't being shared with a post-adoption support team. So there was no support. So then when my behaviour deteriorated, there was nowhere to go. And I think that's my biggest takeaway. I know there is some support now, but there's not enough. And it depends where you live. It's a postcode lottery to how much you get, what funding you get, and what's available with that funding.
Thanks, Dawn. And, struggling in school, and some very important points there, I think, both of you making about expectations, really, and what both parental and societal expectations are of adopted young people, and maybe those are unrealistic. I'd like to turn to the other three. Anyone like to tell me more about interventions that might have worked or things that helped, basically? Aaliyah.
I would say that I had a great relationship with lots of my teachers. So my teachers were my friends just as much as my friends were. I would say that this is, however, something to be really aware of. I had a very skewed idea on positions of authority and appropriate relationships, and I would be blindly faithful and trusting of people that I put on a pedestal like teachers. Although in my secondary school, all of my teachers were genuinely fantastic and pushed me educationally. And I would say that for me, it's about being proactive, not reactive. All care I ever received was reactive when something went really wrong. And my brother got expelled from the same school again that I was part of the student leadership team from. And he was if you read The Primal Wound, I'm good adoptee, he's bad adoptee. He hurts outwards, I hurt inwards. And it's almost the squeaky wheel gets the grease, even though he fell through the net many times. And I'm able to kind of use what I have to my advantage in a bit of a different way. I would say that when I was into CAMS, that helped. although it also put a bit of a dent into my family situation at home, because it meant that obviously something was very much wrong with me. I feel like being functional has always been to my detriment, because nobody knew I was adopted. Nobody knew I was care experienced. People don't know to this day that I have things I struggle with unless I explicitly tell them. And there are signs, there are things that you can do and spot, but maybe someone's not in the right place to talk about them. Again, I didn't want to even accept I was adopted, because for me, it was the fact that everything I loved could be taken away from me. And like Dawn said, maybe this could be kind of, I might be sent back or taken away. I would say therapy earlier, being told about the prospects of, being adopted, that it's normal to go through issues with your body, and also that it may not necessarily get easier, that, things can happen. I almost felt like, well, I've been perfect all my life and now it's all hitting me in one big go, when actually there were always signs that I wasn't quite happy and that I was struggling with these things. I think that my number one thing to say is that there isn't always an outward sign other than someone needing support. And I think there's a very big distinction between care leaver and care experienced and in care. And I feel like those boundaries need to be broken down and analysed a bit, especially if an adoption seems fine on the outside. There may still be things going on. There may be kind of discontent brewing, especially in those teenage years. And that I felt I was really all alone, and I did not have adequate support. But if you asked me to come forward and say, I'm an adoptee and I need help because of this, I would have not taken it. In fact, at CAMS, my psychiatrist at the time said, I think this is coming from the fact that you're adopted. And I was so offended, I left the room. And I think that that's what you're dealing with, multiple layers of disassociation and avoidance. And actually, I think that level of, I need to not think about this, is the only thing that got me through it, was just thinking, I've got an end goal, which is university and career. And I didn't do any of this rebellion. I didn't do any kicking off or violence. I just kept to myself, in myself, hating myself, punishing myself, exercising for hours, obsessively timetabling. I failed my A levels and did the complete opposite with none of that. And I think that it's the inward control versus the outward control and how you react to things. But I often think that sometimes people that don't show things on the outside get missed in mental health services as an adult and as a teenager.
Thank you, Aaliyah. That's very eloquently put. Being functional has been to my detriment. What a great phrase that is. And you've very eloquently described what it's like being a sort of high functioning person who, the good adoptee, I suppose one might say. Lots of points there. Tiegan or JP, would you like to come in on what was helpful for you?
Well,
yeah, JP.
Well, for me, I was diagnosed by someone at CAMS actually with having ADHD, and I was put on some medication, and that helped me with my behaviour, I suppose. But I was quite unwell. I did try suicide, and thankfully after that failed, I was taken to hospital and given a psychological assessment, mental assessment, and they came back that I wasn't crazy, but I still felt that I wasn't really well in the head. So I went to my social worker, and she, thankfully, through people that she knew of, a therapist, and I got involved in this therapy. I was there for about 2-3 years, and without that therapy and without her having known of she could then put me in contact with, I don't know where I would be.
Thank you. Tegan.
Yeah, I think our first touch, I think school could have done so much more. There were some things they got right, but I think if schools, took more understanding of adoption and the systems being designed for that understanding, but also it being an active understanding. I think it's very easy for people to go, oh, we understand. but then not put those into actual actions in day-to-day life. Even if that's like actually a young person is getting really unregulated and they've thrown something across the classroom, rather than going, right, we're putting you in isolation or whatever punishment form there is at school, going, right, go outside and kick a football for 5 minutes because I know that's what you need. I think that active understanding is really important. I think also if the school had actually been supportive of me being me, like there was so much messaging, I think, throughout my school years of just be more feminine, just be like this, just be that. It'll be easier for you. And it was sort of like, I don't want to be any of that. Why can't you see me as me? And I think they weren't allowing me to have those identities, including being an adoptee and that being a part of my day-to-day life. I think also if there'd been proper intervention with bullying, I think if they'd stopped blaming it for me, understanding that, yes, I might retaliate if someone says something mean to me or pushes me, like I'm not just going to walk away. That is near impossible. If they'd actually properly intervened and helped, in those situations, I think education would be better. And I think that is where my therapist coming into my life massively helped. Like I would say, without my GCSEs, without her, I wouldn't have completed my GCSEs even, I don't think. She was just there, and I think some of the key things she said was, this isn't any of your fault. This is no one understanding you. And actually, yes, we might help you with your emotional regulation. Yes, we might help you with understanding the adoption, the lifelong impacts it has. And she did that on a really great level. She knew I loved learning. So, she gave me lots of lessons as part of the therapy sessions. But I think she was really just open about, no, you're being misunderstood here. She was the one that really helped us have that final push for me to be diagnosed neurodivergent. And she'd seen there being a pattern, and she's like, I see this pattern all the time. And it isn't just your trauma, there is more going on here. And I think it was just my therapist. I had her for 5 years, and she just gave that really personal level of support for me. And that was incredible. And as I say, really changed the direction of where things were going for me, but also my family. And also my adoptive parents received some therapy because, again, they had been through a lot in those few years of secondary school. And I think as a family, it was all receiving that therapy was just life changing, and I think just really gave us that clarity. And I think it just helped as well for me to have someone I could go to at the end of the day and go, this incident happened at school, but give my perspective without any judgment, because I was getting a lot of judgment from school going, well, you could have done that differently, or did you need to do that back in all of that? Whereas she was like there listening to me, my perspective without judgment. And I think that was also something really important, was not receiving judgment when sharing my side of a story and actually being heard. So for me, that therapy just changed my life.
Great, thank you. That's exactly what the therapists in the room need to hear, that can exactly do that, which is great. And I think there are pointers there, aren't there, for social workers, for educators, and all sorts really about the kinds of things which can help. I just want to turn to other kinds of relationships, and we're going to talk a bit later on about birth family and the kind of knowledge that you had about your adoption and that kind of thing. But I just want to think for a moment about the relationships you had as teenagers and transitioning into adulthood with your adoptive family, with your adoptive parents, could be siblings, close friends, could be romantic relationships. How did that go, and how do you think that that was impacted by adoption, really? Anyone would like to start me off? Peter.
So for me, it was, the obvious strains being a family. There was a little bit of weird resentment. So I'm the oldest. I was adopted with my brother, and then my sister, who's from the same birth parents, was adopted about a year later. Then my adopted parents have been told basically the chances of having their own child were almost zero. My baby brother was born. He's about 5 and a bit years younger than me. And as I became a bit more alienated by my parents, of course, traumas, and also being a teenager, one of the things that crept into my head was, are they, playing favourites of him? Honestly, looking back at that now, no, that was ridiculous. But there was that point. Another point that's just hit me is, so I had a relationship when I was about 15 or 16 that lasted a year and a half with a girl across the country over in the Stoke area. But my first real love, I was about 18, turning 19. It was in the summer when I had my first job, moving away from home that summer. And it lasted about 3.5, 4 months, and then it ended. And I'd say that was my first true love. It took me 6 years to get over it. I had no way of coping with that, and I probably coped with that, with the breakup, the same way as, say, a 13-year-old would, except I was an 18-year-old. I was living alone, and I had the resources of an adult. It ended up with me standing up to my neck in the water, in seawater at midnight off the coast of Norfolk, deciding whether I was going to drown myself or not. So there is a way to talk about this delay that can appear, that can happen. Someone who goes for adoptional care can be 18 or 19 or 20 and be living independently as an adult. But actually, when it comes to dealing with traumas and relationships, that's the thing. Moving on from that into my early years, and I'll sum this up quickly, I kind of sunk into the whole thing of speaking to people online who are a lot older than me, start when I was about 20, disrespecting myself a bit. Weirdly enough, though, it wasn't just sexual. I remember the very first time that someone sent me, this woman, she was like in her 30s, she sent me a nude. I sent nudes back. The next day, I was asking her how her day was, and she was surprised I stuck around. And I realized, looking back, I wasn't just looking for, it wasn't about sexual gratification. It was about trying to have a connection and be less lonely. And a friend of mine was going through a wellness diary yesterday. She asked me, she goes, something, what have you not forgiven yourself for that you need to? And I still said, even at the age of 33, I don't feel ready to forgive myself for anything yet, including just disrespecting myself and just doing that at that age, being addicted to that, porn addiction and all these other things. And it's such a hard thing because it wasn't about the sex, it was about, I think, just having someone there. And I got really close to various people online right from my early 20s, and thankfully I now don't do that anymore. But it was filling a hole, and I wasn't alone in life, but sitting up until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning speaking to people in about 4 different time zones, and it just destroyed my sleep pattern. So I could talk about that all day, but yeah.
Thank you, Peter, for that honesty. And you put that very well, searching to fill that hole and wanting connection and everything. Would anyone else like to comment on their relationships during this time? Dawn?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about my parents, my adoptive parents first. Similar to Peter, I felt very lonely. It was an isolation, and I think it's because I felt like I didn't fit in. My parents did go on to have their own biological children. I don't know if that contributed to a feeling of not fitting in, but they look like their children look like them. When they went out together, they were the perfect family of 4, and I was this odd one out who wasn't doing well in school, who was always rebelling. My relationship with my mom from 11 to 20, I would say 22, 23 was horrendous. We just argued. There was very rarely a civil word. We weren't able to communicate without it blowing up, and it was just constantly like that. And that left me feeling like I didn't belong. So I looked for, similar to Peter, I looked for comfort in other people, and anyone that was willing to give me attention and validate my self-esteem, my insecurities. I felt worthless, and anyone that was willing to fill that void was good enough. I had probably like my first or second relationship was with someone who was very physically, emotionally, mentally abusive. He used to tell me how I could dress, what I could wear, where I could go, who I could talk to. And I was only 17, 18 at the time, but I didn't have the relationship with my adoptive parents to talk about it because I didn't trust them. We weren't communicating well. So it was very easy for that person to maintain that kind of control. And it took me going to university and physically having to be away from that person for things to eventually change. And I think that's something we don't talk about a lot. And especially especially with adoptees, I think we see a lot of inappropriate relationships, not even always sexual or romantic, but people becoming best friends with someone they've not known very long, connecting with people they don't know very, very well, and relying on them all of a sudden, staying with someone for a week that they've only met 2 nights ago, and that's their new best friend. So I think for me, relationships were a real challenge, and it's only now in my 30s I have functioning relationships, functioning friendships, long-lasting friendships that are built on values and shared experiences and communication, and not just because someone made me feel good about myself for 24 hours.
Thank you, Dawn. I mean, you very clearly sort of explained in some ways why we find our young people taking such what we consider to be risks to fill those kind of voids. Briefly, Peter, and I'm going to come to the other 3. What did you want to say?
Just to quickly highlight the point there, talking about the inappropriate relationships. Like, addiction isn't an easy thing to go through, whether it's alcohol addiction, drug addiction, or anything else. But I know there's a general social conversation about sex addiction and inappropriate sexual relationships. I feel like it would have almost been easier for me to open up and say, hey, I'm addicted to alcohol, or I'm addicted to drugs, or I smoke too much, than to say, hey, I'm addicted to porn. I talk to people online and disrespect myself. There's almost an extra level of shame and difficulty in opening up and talking to and getting people to talk about these inappropriate relationships, especially when they turn sexual, because of how we view and talk about sex.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. Who else? Aaliyah, Tiegan, Aaliyah.
Sorry, so with my adoptive family, things were strained at various points. Again, my brother, who is currently actually incarcerated, was very outwards with his feelings. And I think that in our household, at points there were certain tensions, and I feel like I knew how to, like a game of Dance Dance Revolution, where you press the right arrows, and he was able to do that, but he just didn't want to, whereas I was kind of dutifully doing it. And I felt like my job as the eldest daughter was to be the glue and the fixer. And I'll get onto it later, but I feel like that is something that is the same in my birth family dynamic, which is like a punishment, like a Sisyphean task of all tasks. But I very much felt like my job was to function and do. And although there was never really any expectation placed upon me by my parents to say, you need to do good, that was how I felt. And I felt like I owed it to them, that everybody's talking about how amazing adoption is and long lost families. And oh, wouldn't you go looking one day? And it really made me feel insecure and uncertain. And I knew that my mum had had a lot of baby loss, and I was my mum's confidant and best friend. And I feel like that also put a bit of strain on things when I actually wanted to have my own independence and my own beliefs that were perhaps different. And I think my entire life is just the fawn trauma response, right? It's saying what people want to hear, what they want to see. And that didn't leave a lot of room for me. And I made a lot of choices that were potentially not choices I should have made because I was doing it for other people. In fact, I took an A level because a guy I liked did that A level and I failed it. With my brother, I am incredibly close with him and I am fiercely protective of him. But I felt like it was no longer cool to be friends with his sister. So I feel like our relationship struggled and he started to resent me because, again, I was on the trajectory of academia and he was not, and things were prickly as a result. And I almost felt like my success was to his detriment. My parents love me very much and I am so grateful for them. But I feel like because they adopted as a direct result of not being able to have children, I felt they'd always prefer a biological child to me. And they never said this, but this is what I felt. So I felt like I had to kind of almost best any temporarily, mental biological children they could have had. I had to kind of prove my worth and be grateful for kind of bed, food, and board. I had to really show gratitude by being the best person I could be. With friends, I would say I didn't struggle too much with friends. I had struggles with ending of friendships a lot. I feel like I struggle with closure to this day. I struggled a lot when I'm talking about blind faith of people in positions of authority. A lot, even if people potentially didn't have my best interests at heart, especially with, like I'm saying about my teachers earlier, as I got older, that was an issue for me. And that I think that I had kind of almost a vulnerability sign, right? And at college, I was a bit more open about things with my eating disorder. So my name was literally read on the register, and it was like a big warning sign for any potential, predator or vulture. This person is vulnerable, damaged goods, come here for easy gratification and approval. And I would be so grateful to have people in my life. I would give them anything and everything just to keep them around. With boys, I particularly chose boys that did not like me or mean to me because I felt like I had something to prove. And if somebody loved me unconditionally, then it was kind of not worthwhile because I didn't have to do anything. And actually being with my long-term partner now, my husband, is really difficult because he doesn't ask anything of me and I don't have to change myself. I think that I had a lot of probably inappropriate relationships, inappropriate dealings online. I think that I wanted not attention, but to be seen. And as somebody who grew up in a household, my birth mix is half Pakistani, half Barbados. My adoptive parents are half Pakistani, half Jamaican. So it's a really similar mix. I grew up in a very white area and all my friends were 5'2" blondes. And I am, you can't tell, but a 6 foot, very curly haired, glasses, just a complete, kind of see in the school pictures. And I never really fit in. And I so desperately wanted to just be a grey blur like everybody else. And I think that I was willing to do anything to fit in. And also, it was another form of self-harm, like with the eating, to diminish myself for the benefit of other people. Yes.
Thank you, Aaliyah. That's really very honest, and thank you very much. Tiegan or JP on that question? Relationships. Anyone got anything they'd like to add? JP.
I was taken into care with my young brother and my elder sister. We were together in care for about 7 months. We were split up. So my sister left, and I didn't know at the time, but she ended up going back to the birth family. I was there with my little brother for about 5 months before then. I was adopted before him, so I had to leave. Very strange. I went to a single mum household. Feel like from the beginning we had a rocky start. I sort of understood, like, not my mother, so don't try and mother me. It was very, very, it was just rough from the start, I'd say. It was abusive emotionally, physically, both ends. I ran away, actually, when I got to around 15. I was contacted actually by the sister who left to return to the birth family. She contacted me over Facebook, and I explained the situation. She invited me to live with her, so I moved out and I went to go live with her. But I do believe at the very start, I had a good relationship with my social worker, but I don't feel like my mum had enough the worker of her own or enough support around her from the get-go to be able to cope or manage, survive basically with a child like me, because she'd gone from having no children to having basically a 6-year-old child I'd already been imprinted on. And so, yeah, I feel like there was a lot of issues to go. And if she'd have got more help from the very start, I believe things would have, may have even turned out better than they actually ended up. But that's just my thought.
Thanks, JP. Tiegan, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so I've already touched on the relationship with my parents, but I grew up in my adoptive home as an only child, but I'm not an only child. I have 3 siblings. 2 of them are younger, and then I've got an older one. And I would say now I'm closer to my oldest sister, and I think the reason is just our age gap is smaller. We always say we sort of came in pairs. But I didn't have any contact with any of my sisters growing up. Bit weird, really. And I think that's something I reflect on is I think was challenging is not having that sibling relationship as you grew up. I think a lot of my peers were talking about things they were doing with their, sisters or brothers or whoever over the weekend, going out as family days out, sharing memories. I would not have any of that, and I never will because obviously that time is gone now. But I think also not having that relationship growing up meant, I think your sister, your brother, whoever, your siblings are someone you can confide in a lot of the time. And not having that, I think sometimes was missed. I think whilst my adoptive parents are incredible, I think there's a reality of you don't always want to share everything with them. You can't realistically, it's a lot almost to always be going to your parents about every single issue. And I think actually if I had siblings, I was like, oh, at school today, this really annoying happened or whatever. And there just wasn't that. And I think I also really struggled with friendships at school. And actually, now I've moved out of school, I realised why was I so, wanting friendships? And actually, I didn't. It was the school that was telling me, you need friends. And I was like, but I don't want them. And they're like, that's not normal. Have friends. And actually, they were the ones, I had one good friendship at secondary school, and our teachers forcibly split us apart because they decided we were too close as friends and you can't just have one friendship. I reflect on it now, that really triggered my attachment issues. Forcibly being told, you're not allowed to spend lunch with this person and having a teacher guarding both of you. That was triggering, to say the least. Now, at that time, I didn't know why, but now on reflection, it was a massive trigger. And actually, then I was told by the teachers, oh, you know, just sit with the girls and be into fashion and makeup, as it'll make your life easier. I ended up leaving in tears, which of course the whole school saw. And I think that really made friendships then later on harder, because no one wanted anything to do with me. Because, oh, look, she cried as, you know, she got split away from her friend. How pathetic. But I think actually on reflection, the school kept trying to force me into friendships, but I'm quite happy a lot of the time, just plodding on my own, you know, keeping to myself. I have a lot of interest in stuff. But I think it's also made me miss, I think, in some ways, that sibling relationship, because obviously we wouldn't want to spend every waking moment. And obviously, even if we had contact, we wouldn't have been able to do that. But I think it is that reflection of it would have been nice to have that connection and spend those important moments together, you know, proms, you know, completing GCSEs, going to college, whatever it is, those little milestones growing up that actually I didn't get to share with my sister. And I think just that odd gap there always was. And I think, you know, it is weird reflecting back on our like teenagerhood together and actually how similar some of the experiences we were going through. Like, we sit there going, are we twins? Because how on earth did this happen to both of us? But when we reflect even more of, wouldn't it have been great that we would have really got what each other had? And I think now, you know, I've got an incredible relationship with my older sister. Like, whenever we're together, we can't stop laughing. We have so many shared interests. We can't stop talking. We once sat on a bench for over 2 hours in the cold, just non-stop talking, and we hadn't even realized how long had gone by. But actually, it's a really important relationship I now have, because we are there just to support each other and another network and another person that always is there.
Thanks, Tiegan. Well, you've taken us into talking about birth family, which is great, and the loss of those relationships with birth parents and siblings. And one might reflect that all the relationship difficulties that we've been talking about here sort of, you know, start with that point of the loss of those kind of relationships. So we're entering a period in adoption now where there's a drive for greater openness and going on and more knowledge. So I'm just wondering if people could just reflect a little bit on what you knew as a teenager, early adult, and how birth family figured in your sense of your life and your identity and that kind of thing. What part did that play? Aaliyah?
So for me, like I said earlier, I just did not want to know. And I was placed with one foster family from when I was 7 months up until the point I was 2 and given to my adoptive parents. And they almost wanted to adopt me actually, but my adoptive parents convinced them to hand me over. And they had a daughter, and I would have fitted in just right because they were a mixed race family too, different mix, white and black, but I would have fitted in just fine. And they reluctantly let me go, and they would wish me a happy birthday every year. And I would dread it. And I would dread it because, again, it was a reminder that everything I loved wasn't really mine and it could be taken away from me at the drop of a hat, just like social, going from house to house to house, place to place to place. And I think a lot of the time people make this assumption that children can't remember things, and maybe that is the case. I mean, I know my brother can't remember a lot of things, but he's 2 years old, 2 years younger than me. I'm 2 years older. I remember a lot of things, and I remember feelings, I remember outfits, I remember so much of my childhood, of my toddlerhood, and I definitely remember at points feeling scared and upset. I knew that my birth family I was taken from my birth family. I knew that social services took me away and they were not allowed any contact, and that my name was changed. So my adoptive parents wanted to keep that link. So they used my birth name as my middle name, gave me a new first name, and I took their last name. I was always told if I wanted to know anything, I could ask, and I didn't really take them up on that. But I knew vaguely that my birth parents were potentially not suitable for me to be around, but I knew that my birth mum was very, very smart. Her family didn't approve of the relationship with my birth father, and that was it. And I kind of left it there. When I was 17 and a few months old, so about to go to university, I said, look, you know what? I know I have a birth sister. They told me that all my life. So I was writing diaries to this older birth sister who was biologically mine, 2 years old, I think, a year older. And I thought all my life I wanted a sister, and she's going to be older than me. So I've been writing diary entries to my sister my whole life. And I said, look, I'm going to turn 18 soon, so I'm going to put myself on the no contact register because I know my parents might not be the greatest because I was taken away from them. So I don't want any contact, but I'm going to leave the door open for my sister. And my mum said, just wait till your dad gets home. And he strolls right in and he goes, why would you go and do a thing like that for? She's dead. And I thought she was alive my whole life. And then I thought, okay, he thought I'd known, I didn't know. So I kind of thought, right, well, I've got to go to university soon, so I'll put that in a box and I'll deal with it later. And then I kind of trundled along until the third year of my degree. And I thought, you know what, I need to go digging. And during university, my relationship with my adoptive parents really struggled to the point of no contact for quite a while. And I thought, you know what, maybe I'll seek what I'm looking for elsewhere, which was a big mistake. I did a DNA test, which led to a second cousin who knew my maternal family and so on and so forth. But the long and short of it is, I know all of my birth family. I am one of at least 11 half siblings. My birth mother is the same age as one of my half siblings. My birth dad is 75. My birth mum is in her 40s, early 40s. So that should tell you all you need to know. And I was taken very much for a reason. My birth sister, who was older than me, died as a baby in their care. And they also ran away to Barbados to have another daughter after I was taken. And that really destroyed me internally to know that they could do that. All this hope my whole life that I would be kind of welcomed back with open arms, which I was, but I was again in a role where I was the fixer and everybody was so amazed at how I was so functional and, oh, well, you get it from me or you get it from so-and-so. But it really destroyed me. Looking for my birth family destroyed me. And I didn't have the funds for an intermediary because I didn't have the support system to live at home. I pay my rent, I pay my bills, I have to go to work. And finding my birth family has been probably the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to me in my whole life. Has it been rewarding? Yes. When I look in the mirror sometimes or pictures, does it hurt to see my birth family now that I know of in my face? Absolutely. Do I love my half siblings? Yes. But has it been difficult? Of course. I now know what's happened to the fullest extent. And it's been really difficult because people ask or people say when you're adopted, wouldn't it be good to go back, without thinking about the trauma and the amount of effort that takes to find people. I think that it's not always a happy ending. These relationships are fraught, they're very difficult, they are ongoing, and they are very complex. And it's bad enough having one difficult family, which a lot of adult adoptees have difficult relationships, frustrated relationships with their adoptive family unit. But to have two and to manage them, especially when there are multiple children, things going on, making sure people feel appreciated or you're spending enough time, it is really, really difficult. And I did not expect that. So again, I resat my third year at uni because I couldn't cope. And to this day, I think it taught me about boundaries, but also that finding your birth family is not what it's pitched to be. I think that there should be a lot more support. My adoptive family trying to protect me destroyed my later in life letter. There is no copy. I know they did it to protect me, but I deserve to know. That was for me, written by me, for me. It makes me furious that adult adoptees do not have the same right as one another to access their records based on arbitrarily when they were adopted. Trying to find out anything about adoption is incredibly difficult. And thank God I'm fluent in English. And thank God I have the academic aptitude to go looking and I had the money to pay for a DNA test, because it is so difficult to find your roots and there is no support when you finally do. Like I said, kicked out at 24, waiting till 25 to start at least 3 years of psychotherapy on the NHS. And it is tough holding down a full-time job, doing a postgrad at the weekends and being a functional person and partner.
Thank you. That very eloquently put. If there is ever a reason why we should have properly funded intermediary services, then just replay the last few minutes of that this video and you'll find them there in a nutshell. Peter.
So it started off with me with so my birth family contact didn't actually come until much later, but my siblings were my big one. So as I said, I grew up, they were special needs, and I was kind of coming to this thing that actually I am quite affected of things, but I was trying to, all of my siblings and half siblings are severe special needs. Now I am disabled, but I was always trying to say like, well, I'm not like them, and almost distancing myself from the genetics of it. A big point that's just come up into my mind is that so my sister, she has emotional behavioral difficulties. She's a compulsive liar. So she's just turned 30. She is very difficult to support. She also appears quite childlike, and she is bounced from local authority to local authority to local authority. She's not a bad person, but she is so difficult to support that no one's going to have to support her, and it's meant that she's become like a weight on the family to the point that I've had to cut contact with her. I have, apart from when I've been over at my dad's, and every now and again he'll have a call with her, and when I've been over in France, I've just happened to have a call. I think I've had 3 or 4 5-minute conversations with my sister in the last 2 years. And before that, there was a whole 4 or 5 year period where I would just ask my dad, is she alive still? The fact is that, like, we talk about like the effects on us, but also many of us have siblings. And when I was working on my project in the summer speaking to adoptees, a couple of others talked about how they had siblings that was just so struggling and so they weren't getting the support they needed. It was dragging the rest of the family down, and people were having to step back for their own mental well-being. So it's not just about supporting that single adopted person, it's about supporting their siblings as well who are also adopted, because if you're not supporting them, it can drag the whole lot down.
Yeah.
Going on to another point, which is, so my positive ending was going to be, I started university when I was 25, 26. I joke, my first year university, I got to be 19. So the early adulthood kind of finished in my late 20s for me. About 5 or 6 years ago, my birth father, through a long story, appeared out of nowhere, didn't even know he was alive. Now, after about 3 or 4 months of talking to him, something happened that made me stop talking to him and block him. There had been allegations from before I was born about him and children. Something happened with him and someone in my family that made me realize that those allegations were probably true. So I blocked him. I'd also found out that my birth mother, while severely mentally vulnerable, was also genuinely, people had been groomed under her roof, and she'd said some awful things to my siblings when she'd appeared. So it's a weird feeling to talk about, and I'm sure other people may have had this before. I felt almost disgusted by my own genetics and my own blood, which is a weird thing to imagine. And that happened to me when I was about 27, 28. But there's people I've spoken to in early 20s and even their teenage years who, as you're uncovering things about your family, about your birth family, some of it is really quite horrific. It's not just about the stuff that's done to you, but about the people that the parents that made you were.
Yes, a good point of the effects on your own sense of identity, Dawn.
Yeah, I kind of want to pick up on that point. So I dislike myself because I dislike my birth family. Based on the information that I had received growing up. So I always knew I was adopted. I went into care when I was 2.5. I moved in with my adoptive family when I was 4, so there's no way I couldn't know. And I don't like myself because I don't like where I come from. My parents are bad people and they've done bad things. So I'm a bad person and I'm going to inevitably do bad things, and that can't be changed. What I think I really want to get across is the difference support and access to knowledge makes. So I think for my understanding of what everyone's talking about, and from other adoptees, I know the biggest inhibitor to understanding our identity and feeling comfortable with ourselves and where we come from to an extent that we can manage it is knowledge and access to knowledge. And adoptees' identity is so policed. What you know, when you know it, and how you find it out is decided by everyone but the adoptee, and that is the biggest flaw in adoption for me. The lack of direct contact, be that face-to-face, digital, properly managed letterbox contact, is contributing to these identity issues. When I was first placed for adoption, my adoptive parents were told my birth mum had died, and to tell myself and my sister, they weren't sure how to disclose it, so they hadn't told us for a couple of days. Thankfully, they hadn't, because they got a call from a social worker saying, "Oh, sorry, wrong person. She's not dead." And since then, I've never heard anything about her, so I wouldn't know if she is or isn't dead. I do know now, having gone through reunion and sought her out myself. But the fact is that I'm 30 and no one has ever got in contact regarding my story, where I'm come from, who my family are, whether they're alive. And I also, like Aaliyah, have 11 half siblings. So that's not just me, that's 11 other children that are going through the same identity crisis and issues. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's just
Well said, Dawn. Tiegan or JP, would you like to add to that? Yeah, Tiegan.
Yeah, it's going to go on from what Dawn says. I think whilst I knew quite a bit growing up about my birth family, my birth identity, you know, my adoptive parents were always really clear on anything they knew I would know at a child level, appropriate level. and I did have contact with my maternal grandparents. Direct contact for me started dominoing almost about 16 after I met my maternal grandparents. From there, different members of family got in touch with me, or I got in touch with them through connections. And I'd say that's been a massive help, because it's actually meant some of the information that for whatever reason didn't ever really get passed on, someone could tell me. And I think the fact my birth family could tell me like face to face or directly meant there wasn't any interpretation issues, there wasn't any filtration or, a bit Chinese whispers where if something gets missed that's key. It was there in black and white, and you could take it with a pinch of salt. But at the end of the day, it's the best of the stories you go and get. And it massively helped me understand my identity, because I think growing up there was still a lot of gaps, especially with my paternal family for some unknown reason, which I think was just, it wasn't seen as important as maternal family, which I don't agree with personally. And I think secondary school had really highlighted, through genetic lessons, and thankfully I knew what my birth parents looked like, but very clear of, you might be like your parents, there's so many of those sort of things. And actually hearing from them, understanding my Irish heritage. For example, I didn't know there was Irish heritage on my dad's side. Actually finding that out was like, I'm more Irish than I thought I was. And actually, I now say my ethnicity is Irish. But the only reason I've been able to do that is understanding that. I've seen those similarities and differences with my birth family. I've seen where maybe certain hobbies, interests, dislikes. Like, I now always blame my father for my slight fear of heights because he has it. And I'm like, out of all the things you could have given me, fear of heights, really? Like, that's not helpful. But it's just really helped me like understand myself more, and I think close gaps. And I think there was a whole journey of, I was diagnosed neurodivergent, and there was other things that helped me sort of close gaps in my identity, but just really gave me a bit more of a rounded picture, and I could do what I liked with that. I could use it in any way. Could have easily gone, right, I know my birth identity, but I'm thrown out of the window. But I also could take it on board and use the bits of identity that stuck with me.
Thank you. JP, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I had contact with my little brother after we had all gone our separate ways, up till about the age of 14, 15. And then because of a paperwork error, basically his adopted surname was printed on a piece of paper, came into the hands of my birth family, and they were able to track us down on Facebook. And because I went back to the birth family, I was then cut off from having contact with my little brother at all. So our relationship has suffered because of that. But my main reason for returning basically to the birth was just to go back to my roots and to try and rebuild bonds that had been broken. And that was it, mainly. It was nothing more than that. I had these memories of a family I'd lived with before. I had names and I had faces in my mind, but I didn't quite it all. And so by going back, I was able to understand it, I think.
Thanks, yeah, thanks, JP. Very eloquently put, everybody, just how complicated that is. And let's be clear, if you're a young adopted adult at the moment, unless you happen to live in a very lucky area, then you can't get an intermediary service without paying for it. And that really, given what we've just heard here today, is quite extraordinary. We decided when we met before the meeting that we'd like to finish on a bit of a positive, and a couple of you have touched on it a bit already, but really, and just in less than a minute each, I think we've probably got. Can you just give us a changing point? When did things, as far as they are okay at the moment, and I'm not saying it's all okay, how did that happen? When did that start? Dawn.
So in my last year of my second university, when I was about 23, I got support from PAC-UK to access my records. And I also spoke openly with my adoptive parents about that experience. And those conversations with that support were the step forward I needed. And my relationship with them has improved significantly since then. And also my understanding of myself and my identity has changed beyond anything I could ever imagine. And I'm in a much healthier and happier place since doing that.
Great. Thanks, Dawn. Anybody else? Turning points? Yes, Peter.
So I was about 24, I think, when it happened. My partner, my then fiance at the time, had a miscarriage. back in November 2015. And so I held it together, had a breakdown around Boxing Day, got referred back to adult mental health services. And in the late spring, early summer, I had to quickly go through and reassess my ADHD and depression to check it was all there. Now, everyone talks about that pivotal figure, the figure that changes, whether it's a social worker or something else. For me, it's a psychiatrist, and I cannot remember his name or even his face or his voice. But I remember in our conversations, he then one day was like, Pete, you talk quite eloquently. I want to do an IQ test. I tested hard, and he goes, why the hell are you not in education? And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, go and do an access course. And I was like, what's an access course? Now, I'd had people saying this to me before, but something about that stuck with me. Later that summer, when I did my English and maths entry test to get into it, got into it fine. September 2016, started my access course. 1 year later, September 2017, I think it's the 13th or the 11th of September. I remember sitting in my student room. There was a blue sky. I was looking at it, and I remember typing a status saying thank you to everyone, crying as I was ready to go to my first lecture. It took me 6 years to do a 4-year degree, but I now have a journalism degree. I've just finished a master's, which has been downgraded to a postgrad diploma, but somehow I'm a graduate and a postgraduate, and that wasn't ever on the cards. So that's
great stuff. Great stuff. Who else would like to share anybody with their changing moments, their happy moment? JP.
I think turning point was just accepting that I needed help, and then accepting I needed help was actually the help. So I approached my social worker. She got me into therapy, but it was actually sticking to it by, the hard work and the 2 years that I'm going through that experience. That is what was my turning point and what changed my life around completely.
Super. Thanks, JP. Tiegan, Aaliyah, either of you? Tiegan.
I think for me, it's not just one thing. I think it is a staggered. I think that's a reality of not one thing changes your life overnight. I think it was when I started to leave secondary school. It was when I started therapy. But I think the big point was when I turned 18. I know COVID was a really hard time for a lot of people, including me. But at the same time, it was one of those times that did change my life for the better. I think, as I say, I got to relax more. I could really reflect on what was going on in my life, how I wanted to go forward. I did an access course, which was incredible. Education, university still was hell, but I started being able to do education I enjoyed and where I was supported. University, not so much, but at that point, I had really accepted education just doesn't support you if you're neurodivergent sometimes, and you just got to get on with it. But actually, I now get to engage in lots of different opportunities I enjoy. I'm doing stuff I enjoy, hobbies, extracurricular sort of learning. I'm going to museums and doing lots of stuff I absolutely love. And I've just finished my degree, and I think that was a real changing point of when it's like, you don't need to be in 9 till 5 in a space. You don't need to do this or that. It was very much up to me, and I could step away from the world and go, well, what do I want from the world, or how do I interact with the world?
Thank you. Aaliyah.
I would say for me, it was the creation of my safe space. So I have a husband. He is so supportive. We've been together for 7 and a bit years. He loves me unconditionally, and not just him, but staggered. I mean, I almost want to say to the question on a bit of an unhappy note, like I'll let you know when I get there and I feel it. But I'm doing my postgraduate qualification just by virtue of winning a scholarship. And I never thought I'd get that, and it doesn't feel real, but here I am doing the master's. And I never thought I'd get my degree, but I did it. And I think it's just lots of kind people that do their jobs, that are underpaid and overworked, that actually take the time, that go above and beyond, even though they really are at the end of their tether. And those little glints of human nature and compassion at various stages of my life is the reason I am still here and why I'm still pushing on. I think at this point, pure spite and bitterness, not actually from internal want, but again, hopefully one day, just for the love of myself, I think is the overall goal.
Great, thank you. We're at the end of today's event, and I mean, it's been incredible. I can only just commend you for your thoughtfulness and integrity and honesty, really. It's been just really eye-opening, I think. So thank you ever so much. And I think everyone who's attended will want to pass on those thanks. So stick them in the chat or whatever. We'll also be sending you a feedback form so you can share your thoughts through that. We're going to put this towards the end of the week, probably onto the PAC-UK website, the recording. We will be showing the recording back to or sharing that with the participants, just in case they've overshared and want to take anything out, because it's they've been very honest today, and you know, we want to offer them that opportunity. But I hope it's been useful for you. We've got events going on all week. We've got our education film tomorrow. I know people have been asking education questions in the chat, and we've touched on that, but maybe not enough. But we've got an education film we're showing tomorrow, a birth parent event on Wednesday lunchtime. Thursday lunchtime, we're talking about intermediary and funding and Family Connect. And then we have an adoptees meeting, which sadly is already fully booked on Friday. So our advice line is open if that's raised any questions for anybody. And otherwise, I'd just like to say a big thank you again, and thank you so much for attending. Goodbye.